cannabis, when I was growing up, was illegal. You could go to jail for it.
Mm-hmm.
People still smoke pot. It happened. The idea was that it was much less potent. We can talk about that. But now it's a whole industry.
Yes.
And the edible industry has contributed to this greatly because it bypasses the blowing of smoke, the smell, and a number of other things. So what are your thoughts about cannabis as something that can be used, quote unquote, recreationally, medicinally, and its potential for abuse? And then let's talk about how those things have been amplified or reduced by the fact that it's essentially legal or decriminalized. So what are your thoughts on cannabis?
Yeah, so whenever I talk about it, I make a distinction between sort of old and new cannabis. So, if you go back to the 80s and 90s, when, as you mentioned, it was illegal everywhere, the THC content, that's the principal intoxicant, would be, 3, 4, 5%, something like that on average. And now, studies of legal sales show the average product is about 20%. So that's dramatically stronger. The other point is how people use it is different, perhaps related to that high potency. Jonathan Calkins pulled together a lot of really interesting data that got a lot of play, and it showed that about 42% of people who use cannabis use it every day or almost every day. That is also different. So if you go back in the past, the more modal user might have been once or twice a week. So you put those things together. So you take somebody, what was like an 80s pot smoker? Well, on weekends, I'd smoke a joint at, 5%. But now if it means every day I'm consuming 20%, you quickly realize like their brain exposure is dramatically higher, about 65 times higher between the modes of those two experiences. And what does 65 times mean? Well, it coincidentally is also the potency difference between a coca leaf and cocaine. That is 65 times 2. So it's a big difference. And as you know, dose makes the poison. So it is just a really different drug than what was back there. And this is very hard to get across to parents because their view is like, I smoked weed, who cares if my 15-year-old is using it? It's like, but that's kind of saying you drank low alcohol beer and you're not concerned that your 15-year-old is guzzling vodka. That's kind of the difference. And it's just a bigger deal than it used to be. Even when you take away the fact that you have an industry really pushing it, just the drug is stronger, more addictive. Does it have any medical applications? Almost surely. The cannabinoid receptor system evolutionarily is one of the oldest in the history of Homo sapiens. It is both in the brain, but it's also in the body. There are clearly going to be some applications for pain. There's many people would say they spontaneously get relief. It's hard to tell always what that means because sometimes that's just relief from withdrawal. But probably some type of medical applications for pain will come out of this plant. We do have some out of the CBD, which is the non-intoxicating part, as a medication that is used in seizure disorders in kids. So there'll be some other things like that for sure. It's easier to study this than it has ever been before. About 2020, Congress changed the way research works, so it's a lot simpler to do it. So we'll figure those things out. But it is just a more dangerous drug than it was, when I was a young person.
I had a guest on the podcast who's a cannabis researcher, runs an animal lab. And we invited him on because I had released a solo episode about cannabis. We touched on some of the risk for psychosis in young men and made some points about, frankly, concerns about cannabis because of the high THC content. He was not happy with the things I said. He made that clear on social media. So, by the way, this isn't the way to get invited on the podcast, but we invited him on, and I think we had a very fruitful discussion where he clarified a few things for me. And one of the things that he claims is that despite the higher THC content, that there's a distinct difference between smoked versus edible cannabis, whereby people who smoke cannabis, even the high THC cannabis, are very good at gauging the kind of level of high so that they don't go into paranoid modes. They don't surpass the plane of high that would make them feel paranoid or put them into a psychotic episode. But that people who take edibles, because it's harder to gauge where you're at, if you can just swallow an edible or even nibble on an edible, often surpass the level at which they would be comfortable, meaning at which there's a psychotic episode or there's paranoia. So he was making this kind of soft argument for the fact that the elevated THC levels in cannabis are not such a problem because people are essentially taking less to offset the difference.
Yeah, I think there's no evidence for that at all. In fact, and people are surprisingly bad, even experienced pot smokers, at judging in lab studies of like how strong different cannabis is. I don't agree with that part, but I do agree we should think about the edibles differently because of the onset is different through the gut. So when you smoke anything, you get that goes very efficiently, to the brain. But when you eat something, it takes a while, to have its effect. And so particularly when these products came out and a lot of people were new to them, they would, bite down on one piece of the bar, the cookie or whatever. 5 minutes later, I feel the same. Take another bite, still feel the same, and then just eat the whole thing. And then it would all hit them like a train. And that does happen. The other thing that is true is that a lot of these products are not well made, or they're not up to like the standards of like you would have a cookie. You would never open up a bag of chocolate chip cookies in the United States and find all the chocolate chips at one end and just dough and the rest. But that does happen with cannabis products in legal markets. And so if you just bite on the wrong part, you're getting the whole enchilada, so to speak, because it's not evenly blended through. And there's some people who've gotten into trouble on that as well.
Interesting. What about the psychosis risk?
Yeah, so I was very skeptical of this literature for years. Not to say that the science was bad, but just like it seemed to me there were lots of ways to explain it. And I'm a lot less skeptical now, candidly, because in the old studies there were men who had used cannabis in teen years, and then they would have higher rates of psychotic disorders in adult. These were studies based on like Swedish registries, because everybody has to register for the military, and they would track people, and it's quite amazing data. So it is a whole national data. That's good, but there's lots of reasons that could come about. Could be a common factor between those two things. But the evidence has gotten stronger as the drug has gotten stronger. And again, we got to realize people are using it much more intensely. So if this effect is there, it's much more plausible that it would be from a much stronger drug used, every day, could generate higher rates of psychosis. It's hard to test this because it's a rare, thankfully, condition, but I think there is, probably something there. I'm sad to say. I wish there weren't, but there probably is something there. I would not use cannabis if I had any first-degree relatives with any schizophrenia, schizoid personality, anything in the bipolar disorder. I would not personally recommend that for anybody. I think that's probably quite risky.
What about the cardiac risk and other health risks? I've heard recently that there's a direct risk of cannabis, even if it's not smoked or vaped, on cardiac health.
I'm not sure of non-smoked cannabis in the heart. I mean, I haven't looked at that literature, so I don't know the answer to that. I realize there's one point I should touch on that you also raised earlier about first drinking, which is everything is different when the brain is plastic, and our brains are most highly plastic, when we're young, and so a lot of these effects, the worst things, are going to be because people start when they're in teen or late single digit. That's where addictions overwhelmingly start, and that is where, if there is a psychotic risk, it's almost surely then during that period of brain development before people get their first psychotic break, which tends to be around 18, 19, 20, 21. I'd worry about it less for anything. Initiating a substance when you're 50 is far less likely to end you up with an addiction or some other terrible thing than when you're young.
I'm sure everyone knows at least one person or has heard of one person who's very productive in their life, healthy family, job, et cetera, high energy, who uses cannabis. In my observation, they are the rare exception. And there are a lot of examples of people who use cannabis who don't really go anywhere in life. They don't go through the normal developmental progression of finding a job that can sustain them, right? Of organizing their life, their relationship life, their professional life, and clearly there are other aspects to life, but those are key ones, right? And what are the data on high THC or just frequency of cannabis use as it relates to life progression? Failure to launch, we call it now. Typically it's guys, young men that fail to launch. And I want to be clear, not for political reasons, but I want to be clear. When I say fail to launch, I don't mean that every kid has to go to college and be a varsity athlete or any of this, but just moving out of one's home eventually, getting a regular job, keeping the job, hopefully having healthy relationships of various kinds, and being self-sustaining. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, for example, I did Ezra Klein's show. He's obviously a very successful guy, and he mentioned that he sometimes uses cannabis edibles. I mean,
he has that look. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, Ezra, just teasing.
Yeah. I mean, so there are very, very, very successful people who use cannabis for sure. Overall, though, I mean, I'll steal a phrase from Jonathan Calkins. It's like, we have performance enhancement drugs. It's kind of a performance degrading drug. So it's not fentanyl. Your odds of your death being directly traced to it are extraordinarily low. But it does, with regular use, undermine certain things that you need to succeed in the modern world, like short-term memory and concentration and being able to keep track of details. And for some people also, it undermines their sort of motivation to do much of anything. I mean, the couch lock is a real thing. I know families in Palo Alto, where I'm from, a very achievey place, who had straight A, a straight A son, doing everything, starring on sports or whatever, who, 6 months later was just smoking cannabis all day and had no interest in the team he used to star on and the math he used to be great on. And that's pretty frightening. And all those things are not conducive to succeeding in a modern world. If maybe back in an agrarian society, it didn't matter because everything was on muscle power, right? But to succeed in this society, you have to be able to do those things. And you are in competition. If you want a job, computer coding, you're in competition not just with the smartest kids in your neighborhood. You're in competition with the smartest kids who are in Mumbai, and in Tokyo. And if you can't focus, or you're just slower and you can't remember things, or you have trouble making sure you keep track of time, that is going to put you at a disadvantage. You can end up that stereotype of living in mom's basement. That unfortunately is true of a chunk of people who are heavy users of cannabis.
Yeah, I worry a lot about examples of so-and-so is very high achieving and they use cannabis. I had a friend growing up who desperately wanted to be a professional golf player, and he would cite all these professional golf players who were heavy drinkers. He ended up just being good at the heavy drinking part, sadly. I think he turned his life around at some point. But these examples of people who can use very addictive substances and are open about that and are very high achieving, I think there's a real detriment to that messaging. Now, of course, you don't want people to cloak their reality, but it's complicated.
Yeah, and it also has policy risks too. I mean, when you make up the rules, your laws and regulations to think, well, I'm accomplished. I'm able to use this, so that must mean it's pretty safe. It's like that just doesn't follow logically. The fact that you occasionally, take a snort of cocaine or whatever, and you're still a state senator, that doesn't prove that would be safe for everyone. And we know people have different levels of risk. They have different social capital. They have different incentives in their lives, and you can't overgeneralize from a sort of a lucky life or a costed life. Sometimes you can do more of that than you can when there's not many nets sort of between the person and the and the ground.